Hi there, lovely humans. So, last summer there was a cultural phenomenon with the Barbie movie that I really wanted to make content for, but I was trying to support the SAG-AFTRA and the writer strikes during that time, and this was one of the movies that was being struck last summer. So, now that that's all done, we're gonna make the skirt, and I'm gonna share that content with you. So the inspiration for this skirt was I kind of wanted to do what would bewitched Barbie look like. So I grabbed this really fun, easy simplicity pattern, which is from the 1960s roughly. And I want to make one of these full skirts, but it's going to have pockets because pockets are one of the things that all women want on their stuff, right? So when I cut out these paper patterns, I usually cut them out to, if not my size, the largest size on the pattern, which it just so happened to be that my size was the largest size that this one comes in. And I cut to that. I might do some small clips into the tissue paper pattern to fold down to my size if I am going to be using this for multiple years or possibly be wanting to shift between different sizes. But I'm just pinning this into the fabric and cutting it out. I did pre-wash my cotton and I wanted to make sure that I was keeping the seam allowances as close to the original instructions as possible. If you made a project inspired by the Barbie movie in any way, I would love to hear about it down in the comment section, by the way. So please, by all means, give me a thumbs up if you find this a fun concept. And tell me about your own Barbie inspired projects down there. Thanks. I'm going to be the first to admit I kind of read the instructions, but I ignored a lot of them in favor of doing some couture techniques and kind of just figuring out my own way of putting together these pieces. I zigzagged over the edges rather than serging, just to make it go together a little bit quicker. But I think this would still be a great pattern for anyone who's new to sewing or learning how to sew. The big pieces that I sew together first are actually the center front and center backs of the skirt panels. The skirt only comes in 4 pieces, and this sets me up to be able to place my pockets next. Now, to mark my seam allowances in on my pockets, I'm actually going to use this really cool tailor's chalk holder that I picked up from Mood. If I'm able to find it on their website, I'll link it down below, and if not, I will find something similar on another website for you. And I use that to draw in where my stitch lines are going to be. So I'm using my seam guide to figure out what my seam allowance is on these pockets, and then I'm just going to chalk around so that I know where my stitch lines need to be. I believe the hem ended up being 5/8 since it is a big for commercial pattern. And I'm just going to mark periodically as I go down the side of this. Now, the reason this gets really important is that these pockets are applied as a patch pocket onto the skirt, so it is not inserted into the skirt itself, sort of like your modern slacks pockets might be. This is going to be stitched on top, so I'm making sure that I have that seam allowance marked out so that I have correct hems and seam allowances on each pocket becomes really important to making that top seam on my pocket look even. And once I got all of those marked in there with the chalk, it's time to get out my handy dandy needle case. Thank you, Adelicia, for this one. And I'm gonna make sure to baste in my seams. That way I can easily pick these stitches out once it's sewn onto the pocket, but I'm not having to fight with the raw edges while I'm fighting with the skirt around my sewing machine needle. I'm using actual basting thread, which is not very strong. It's really meant to be broken and easily moved around. It's a little strong, but not super strong. If you don't have that, definitely just grab a contrasting color that you'll be able to see as separate from your normal stitching. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting with trying to figure out, am I about to unpick a seam that I need, or is this extra basting stitches? But just as a reminder, if you're finding yourself in that conundrum at any point, your basting stitches should always be wider. These are just kind of here to tack things in place. They are not going to be structural. Feel free to keep them wide and easy to remove later. Once you've achieved that next level and you've gotten your basting done, let's go ahead and get the pocket top hemmed. I wanted to do this by hand just to make it look neat, and it's one of my preferred ways of hemming things. But if you want to do this portion on your sewing machine before you start stitching things down, totally get it. You do you. But I'm going to use a very simple whip stitch to hem this down because I want to make sure that I'm getting all of the pieces onto my hem and at the same time not fighting with it too much. If you've been here for any length of time, you've seen me hem a lot of garments, so I'm going to go ahead and speed this little section up. If you want a more in-depth tutorial, there is going to be a link in the cards, hopefully, as well as down in the description for a video I did on how to hem flimsy fabrics. A lot of that advice is going to work really well for this as well. With the whip stitch, remember you're going to be having a little bit more exposed thread on top of your seam instead of those little hidden ladder-like stitches where everything gets encased into the seam itself. Something I am trying to stay mindful of with this pattern in particular is that the fashion side of my fabric is getting as small a bite of fabric as I can manage. That way my stitches aren't super visible on the outside. And I'm also kind of mitering my edges right where those corners are for the top of my pocket with the pre-basted sections of hem. Makes the end result a little bit neater and easier to use. My preferred way to finish off any hand-sewn seam like that is to bury my needle with the thread into a seam. That way the raw edge of that tail gets tucked away. And much like Barbie, always needing to be flexible, so am I. I did not mark out every single thing I might need on my pattern pieces prior, just because I was worried they were going to rub off. So I'm going to take chalk and now mark the corners of those pockets. That way I can match them up with the finished corners on my patch pockets for sewing in a few minutes with my sewing machine. This is going to seem like a really just obvious thing to do, but just in case you forget, make sure you're flipping your pattern piece upside down to mark your patches on the other side of your center front. If you've matched it right side up on one side, you need to flip it and do the opposite on the other side of your skirt. It'll save you a lot of headaches down the road when you're trying to line up pockets. So the front of the skirt's big detail feature of it is going to be those patch pockets. The back thing that you're going to have to pay attention to is actually going to be the zipper. I hate putting in zippers, but I have finally figured out how to do them well and had consistent success with doing them. Don't ask me about invisible zippers, I still hate their guts. But these more standardized ones that they were using with vintage patterns, I've kind of figured out how to line them up and get everything situated in a way that looks nice by the end. So my big tip on how to insert your zipper is actually going to be do a couple of pins to put it in place, but we really want to baste that in. Now, hear me out on this because I can even hear my past self saying, but isn't it faster just to pin and sew? And you're right, it is faster, but it's not going to be as accurate. That's the big thing. If you're looking for accuracy and a clean finish on something as fiddly as a zipper and inserting a zipper, you want the accuracy of having something basted in place before you try and sew it. And that's what basting that zipper is going to do. But you still kind of need to figure out where you're basting it. So pin it, baste it, and then go and sew it on the machine. I know that I'm not the only person out there in the world that might have learned to sew an entire era of clothing just because it didn't involve these zippers. But it's worthwhile for modern fashion to know how they work and how to put them in. And I hope this little bit of my sewing diary shows you how to insert that zipper really easily. So the other subtle thing you might see that I am doing is the folded edge, the hem of my fabric with my zipper. I'm making sure it matches up and slightly overlaps the teeth rather than exposing them. You could do the exposed thing. There's a Schiaparelli dress that does that, and it does it intentionally to show off the teeth because zippers were new at that point. But for the most part, when you're installing a zipper like this is before invisible zippers got to be super popular. It's kind of my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments. But the goal with this zipper type is that you want to make sure that it's hidden by the fabric. And overlapping by just a hair's breadth, maybe the width of those teeth or less, is going to achieve that without you having a bunch of excess fabric that's going to get stuck in the zipper. So it's a fine line. It's going to take a little bit of practice, but it's totally worth it if you can start to nail just that little feature. So take a look at me basting my fabric down just over the teeth of the zipper. Again, this is how you're going to get that zipper installed and not hate your life and not hate the zipper by the time you're done with this. It's a lot of prep work for something that's going to take you 2 minutes on the sewing machine. But I don't know about how many of you have fought with zippers for hours on a sewing machine. This prep work takes less time than that used to. If this video is being super helpful for you and you want to commend me for my struggles with zippers over the years and persevering, I would really appreciate a thumbs up on this video. It helps this channel and this content spread out to other viewers so that they can get a few extra tips on zippers and vintage fashion when they want it. So thank you so much for that thumbs up, and let's keep working on zippers, huh? Another tip when you're basting in your zipper is to make sure the zipper slide moves around a little bit up and down the teeth, which are going to be those little metal bits, and the slide is the bit with the pull tab. That way, it's not bunching up a bunch of fabric in any one area. Don't keep the slide right next to where you're working all the time, because that's going to cause its own problems and you're never going to have a clean looking zipper. So I closed the zipper about halfway up when I was working along the bottom where the zipper is going to meet up together. That way, my slide wasn't in my way, and all I was fighting with were pins at that point while I basted everything in. Down the road, as I start working on stuff farther and farther up, I'll slide it back down because the part of the zipper I needed it out of the way for is done. It can't hurt anything now. Now for that moment of truth. Isn't a well installed zipper just a thing of beauty? Now that everything is basted in place, I am completely ready to stitch everything down. So I'm going to spend some more quality time on my trusty little brother's sewing machine here. We're going to get everything knocked out. I know you've been using the same machine since you were 17 when it takes you less than a minute at full speed to thread everything, right? I'm going to start with top stitching my patch pockets onto the skirt. Just like we had prepped everything and pinned it down, it makes it super fast for me to be able to just top stitch all of those patch pockets down. That's really what they're kind of designed to do. Have you ever sewn a patch pocket on a garment? I would love to hear if you love or hate them down in the comment section. I was a little bit worried with the size of these and possibly overstuffing them with things and it pulling on my waistband odd when I was making the skirt. And I'm not gonna lie, I shoved my entire camera into one of these pockets at Costume Con and did not cause anything weird at all. So it doesn't matter that these pockets are not being supported from the waistband or from a seam. They seem to support the weight of whatever you put in them very, very well. So I wouldn't mess with their placement, just leave them where they're at and give them a try as they're designed on the pattern. Something else that I recently learned not everybody knows to do when they're sewing down things is if you're having to pivot around a curve or a corner or something on a sewing machine, make sure that you leave the needle down into the fabric to really hold down everything exactly where you want that corner to be. If you don't put the needle down, things can kind of wobble around. It can lead to excess fabric and threads getting bunched up behind or in the front. And doing it this way keeps everything flat and crisp. And it will make your points much, much sharper if you manage to do it this way. So try it out if you've not been doing that and let me know if it gives you better results. Something important to keep in mind when you go to install your zipper is your sewing machine should have a zipper setting, which moves the needle all the way to one side or the other, depending on the style of zipper foot that you have for your sewing machine. Mine moves it all the way to the left, and the zipper foot is designed to have everything roll to the left of the zipper foot. So that's the way that my machine was set up. Please make sure that you kind of check out and know your machine specifications for installing that zipper and how to make the zipper foot work to its best effect. Um, if you're not being careful, you can absolutely break needles while installing zippers. I actually do while installing this one. I broke one and I cut out a bunch of me cussing and having to change out my zipper foot and my sewing needle again. So double check, make sure you've got everything that you need. My preference with the bottom of my zippers when I'm dealing with one in this style is to make it a box and to just go straight across. I'm not going to do any diamonds or interesting shapes at the bottom to try and give the zipper more room. I just double check underneath that I'm not about to sew through some teeth and I go across. A lot like when we were learning how to baste in the zipper and make sure that you move it up and down the teeth, you're also going to want to make sure that you move the zipper up and down the teeth while you're sewing it down on the machine. There's going to be times where it's kind of in your way while you're stitching that seam, and this will keep that way simpler for you. Once the pockets and zipper are installed, really the only thing left for major construction is going to be the side seams on your skirt. And you really don't want the zipper foot for that. So make sure you switch back to your normal foot to be able to stitch those side seams on. There's nothing really special about these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But if you've got questions, by all means, ask down in the comment section or take a look at the sewing instructions inside the pattern itself. Now that we've got all of the big construction done, we can focus on some of the more fiddly bits. So we need to get our waistband put together. I really should have put the interfacing in this waistband like the pattern called for. I ignored it and I regret that choice. So if you are making this pattern out of a quilting cotton weight fabric, definitely take the time to put just a little bit of interfacing, fusible interfacing on the waistband. You'll probably be happier with the way it lays with your end result. This waistband's an actually really simple rectangle. You fold it in half, you stitch the edges shut, and that's going to give you a really clean waistband that goes around you while keeping it simple and not creating too much of a headache. Make sure that you've marked and notched your skirt and your waistband so that they match around that waistline. It's going to make installing this waistband way easier on yourself. Now, this skirt waistband is going to be kept together with some very large skirt hooks and eyes or trouser hooks and eyes. Hooks and bars are another thing. But you'll want these, some scissors, and your thread. So I have found that 2 of these across the waistband actually fits really nicely and secures this really well. Once you know that the skirt bars and hooks are going to fit onto the waistband and you've got a good idea of the placement, you're going to want to prep your thread. I prefer to make sure mine's waxed, and this is going to help it keep that durability as you're working through your thread pieces. You can either stitch those closures on first, or what I'm doing is I'm actually going to whip stitch the inside of my waistband down around the sewing line for my machine stitching. That way my waistband is completely flat when I'm sewing down those closures. It takes a little bit of extra effort to kind of get everything pinched together and perfect right around the zipper. but I've kind of learned to expect that. Take your time to do a few extra stitches just to make sure it's extra secure before you start whip stitching around the seams and trying to get your waistband tacked down properly. If you are particularly skilled with your sewing machine, you could do what's called stitch in a ditch, where you are stitching down inside of the seam along with your sewing machine to make sure everything matches up perfectly. I am not in the mood to try and deal with that at this point because I was trying to finish this right up before a con, so I'm just whip stitching it. I'm faster at that. But if you want to stitch in the ditch and get the waistband stitched down that way, by all means have fun. Now, to stitch down these closures, make sure that your thread is doubled over. That's going to give you the strongest stitch as you're going through, and you're going to just whip stitch around all of the holes. So with the bars, that's going to be going through each eye hole of bar multiple times. I don't recommend going back and forth between them because then you just kind of create a lump across the bar that can get caught and worn down over time. By whip stitching around the outside of it, you're reinforcing it, and it actually kind of pushes it up a bit, in my opinion, so that it accepts the hooked portion of this closure much more easily. Now, just another thing to keep in mind, you don't necessarily have to tie off your thread when you're trying to go in between hooks and bars on the same side. You can just line them up and leave a tail to start stitching that next hook and eye. I prefer to make sure everything matches up as I go, just, makes me feel a little bit better. It gives me some sense of satisfaction as I go through. Do you have any little bits of just sewing quirky things that you do as you're stitching? I would love to hear what you find, just kind of uniquely you, double checking that you've got this on the right track as you go. Most people who sew for any length of time in their lives are going to tell you that stitching down your hem is going to be the most time consuming thing that you do. And with this project, it kind of exemplified that for me. I think sewing around the larger circle was seriously the part that took the most time for me, but your mileage may vary with this pattern. One of the things I did to make sure I had a nice clean edge was I got this double fold bias tape, and I'm not going to bind the edge with this, but I want to make sure that I can fold it over and in, and it's going to create sort of a facing, which will help create some body around the edge of my hem, as well as make sure everything curves nicely while I'm stitching that hem down. So my first step is I've got to go around the entire edge and pin the bias tape in. I was super happy that I found a Barbie pink bias tape at some time other than Halloween or Easter. So go figure. There wasn't quite enough on one package of bias tape to go all the way around this hem, so I ended up needing to piece together two different sets of bias tape. So luckily, I thought ahead and I did pick up a second card of this because I was stitching kind of late and the store was closed by the time I realized that this was truly going to need to be a thing. I did not want to go and spend the time to run 2 inches of fabric through the sewing machine. So I'm just going to pin this together and do a really quick stitch through here. That way I can keep going with my pinning and I don't have to fight with a bunch of fabric or undo all of the pins that I've already done. If anyone out there is curious, doing a backstitch on this section of bias tape was absolutely overkill. I could have done this with a running stitch. All I can say is that I was probably tired and over engineering this particular little seam on my bias tape. It's totally fine that I went straight line to straight line on the bias tape and stitched that together, but the back stitch, like I said, totally unnecessary. But at least I know that that particular section of my skirt is going to be totally fine as I press that seam open, pin it down, and keep moving around the edge of my skirt with that bias tape, right? For me, I found it easiest when I was trying to figure out how to deal with the attaching the bias to itself at the end to kind of pinch together exactly how much it needed to be and to kind of do this like whole bind double back and forth stitch thing to make sure everything went back. And I did that with a single thread that was strong enough to keep everything in place, flexible enough that I could kind of tighten things up as I needed to go, and really move on to doing the actual hemming and ironing that I needed to do for my hem. So I'm going to, first off, once this is all sewn down, iron open that seam. Hems are one of those things, especially with these mid 20th century patterns, that just take the time and do the ironing. You're going to notice it if you're not doing that in 20th century clothing construction. Um, you notice it in other time periods too, but it's really noticeable in the 20th century. Once that was ironed open, I'm going to come back through and I'm just using the edge of that seam and kind of pressing that down so that I have this lovely little facing set up here. There's about the width of the seam allowance with the bias tape and the fabric along the bottom so the bias tape isn't constantly poking out. But at the same time, it's going to pull my actual hem stitches up when I go to base stitch down that entire top edge of the bias. So it's a curve. It's a little bit finicky to get it up on your ironing board. I know it's an extra step. I totally know. I told this to myself super late at night too. But take the time, make sure you're ironing everything. If you can, go and get some glass headed pins so that they don't melt like some of mine are starting to do. I kind of need to go and clean my iron now because I've melted some little globs of plastic onto my iron in a few spots doing this skirt. Continuing on with doing good technique as I made the skirt, it's one of the better made skirts I've done in a very long time. I want to make sure that I pin everything back into place because it's going to take me more than just one evening to hem the skirt. I want to make sure I pin all of that facing back in place as soon as it's flat and beautiful and ready to go. Ultimately, I ended up just folding that entire bias section over and it became a facing, which worked pretty well for my hem. It gave it some great body, and I was able to get everything stitched down and get the length that I wanted by doing it this way. After hemming my skirt, I went through and I took out all of my basting stitches from my zipper. It took a little longer than I wanted it to because I had sewn over the thread in a few spots, but because it's a basting thread, it popped out pretty easily and was not horrible to remove because I used a contrasting color. After I finished removing all of the basting stitches from around my zipper, it was definitely time to get them off of my patch pockets on the front of the skirt. Theoretically, I could have done this at any point after everything was stitched down, but I like to leave taking out basting stitches as like my reward for getting everything else sewn together. It's the last tiny little thing before I can wear my garment. So, what do you think? Did I nail the whole bewitched Barbie kind of look that I was going for with my print and my pattern selections? I would love to hear if you thought that this meets that goal down in the comments. I'm wearing it over a little rockabilly crinoline. And if you loved this project, I'm going to throw another one of these sort of style videos up on the screen. Make sure to check it out too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.